everybody. Welcome here to show 167 on Crypto Voices. Matthew Majinskis, your host here from the Baltics, warming up here finally, joined by my co-host, as always, Alec Harris from Eastern U.S. It's probably already feels like deep summer there.
I mean, you could live anywhere, right? We don't need the sub story.
That's true. Welcome, and very happy today to have our special guest join us, Derek Odom from Non-Von. Briefly, just from what I'm reading on their website, a Dartmouth-affiliated startup bridging the gap between algorithms and computing hardware with the goal to drastically improve AI and multivariate sensor processing applications on the edge and eventually in data centers. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to you, Derek. It's a little bit of a different interview for us, actually, but I think it'll be very interesting. Thank you and welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me on. So I guess a brief background of myself and then the company. Spent 21 years in the Army. Retired from the Army, somehow managed to make it into Tuck Business School. I think COVID had something to do with that. But it was a great experience for me. And while there, I met my two now business partners and started working with their company, Non-Von. They both are affiliated with the engineering school of Dartmouth, the Thayer Engineering School. Professor Richard Granger is still a professor and the head of the brain engineering lab there. And his former doctoral student, now postdoc and CTO of Non-Von, they do a lot of work with neural networks, trying to model brain activity, et cetera, and algorithms. And they realized that the algorithms they had developed were not being run efficiently, either computationally or electrically. I mean, those are both kind of interconnected on existing hardware, GPUs included. Their algorithms they call them massively parallel, and the efficiencies that they found in software could not be replicated when they ran them on existing hardware. So that disconnect between software and hardware is what they identified, and they couldn't find anything, even small batch processors that would process their algorithms efficiently. So they designed them from what they called, the ground up. They looked at their algorithms and tried to figure out how they would design processors to fit their algorithms. And they got some government money to help produce a proof of concept, which we've produced and tested at the beginning of this year, and even done a demo on a real world application. And it works great. The power consumption is exponentially less than anything out there, with a corresponding order of magnitude improvement in memory bandwidth, which is the number we care about for the practical application of massively parallel hardware or algorithms on hardware that is best suited for it. So that's what we're trying to do. Lots of use cases, as the intro you read, all the way from the edge to the data center. So we're at the point where we're trying to amplify the proof of concept to make it a more useful device, and to find use cases and test it out in those use cases, and hopefully find some customers out there that'll start buying our chip.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. And so maybe for openers, since you mentioned it, one of the big topics around data centers and chips is the consumption of power, right? And we hear this a lot in the Bitcoin space, but that narrative is now out there just kind of writ large around energy consumption. I think in the US, supposedly 18% of the power consumption is going to data centers. So what you're saying is that you can significantly create significant efficiencies there. So how does that work, and what are the implications?
So the data centers, especially in the news right now, is all the machine learning, AI, deep data analysis is consuming more and more computational power in the cloud or data center environment. All of those processors are primarily the NVIDIA, GPUs, H100, now B100, and others out there. They all consume a very large amount of power to do the processing. And from my non-technical understanding, they can't moderate that power consumption based on what they're processing. And their processors aren't very efficient for a lot of the massively parallel algorithms. They're they just aren't. So in the crypto mining space, my understanding is there might be some slight improvements as the technology improves, but the big crypto miners have already designed an ASIC specifically for the Bitcoin algorithm. So our chip is a little more general than that. It's not going to solve that problem. That's as efficient as it probably gets, or at least as fast as it can get in the Bitcoin space. They might create some electrical efficiencies as it moves forward. There might be other applications that aren't so well known. I don't know, or people that want to fluctuate or shift back and forth between different cryptocurrency mining applications where ours might fit in. But once we realized that, we kind of shifted to a lot of other potential applications out there. So to answer your question, Alec, our chip could offload a lot of what currently, or even be a co-processor on those NVIDIA massive, GPU processors, and offload specifically the algorithms or the processing that our chip does more efficiently than a GPU. And then you're not using the high power GPU to process what it doesn't need to. So it would be more efficient across the board.
So, and you mentioned, I think initially like edge use cases, right? So is the idea to be able to bring that computational power to locations where you previously wouldn't because you wouldn't have the power, the distributed power to support it?
Exactly. So there's lots of constraints that currently limit the application of a lot of the AI or machine learning tools on the edge. So, devices that are they might be shore powered or connected to a power source, but they're small. So the size of the processor or the heat production of the electricity, all those things constrain integrating those algorithms into the device. And then it gets even worse when you're talking about battery powered devices. So like cameras on my driveway that are battery powered. If you ran a lot of these algorithms on them, they'd be consuming a lot more power as opposed to just using a fairly power efficient Wi-Fi signal that sends the data to the cloud for processing. So that's what's happening for the most part in a lot of the AI smart edge devices that are really leveraging AI algorithms is this done in the cloud as opposed to the edge. So that brings up privacy concerns, brings up that, the cloud is not cheap either. A lot of these companies are spending a lot of money on that cloud computing. And, the consumers don't control the data anymore at that point. So, so yes, the initial use case that we envisioned was edge sensors. So like I mentioned, those cameras, there's lots of other kinds of sensors out there that process sensor data across the board. And in a lot of cases, they're just offloading that data for the actual processing as opposed to having a smart device that either just offloads what is necessary or can provide alerts itself or whatever the use case is for that sensor on the edge. So that's just like the standalone sensor. The other on edge devices, you get up to trying to make robots of all kinds, air, land, sea, space, underwater robots more autonomous. Again, that's sensor data processing and decision making around that sensor data. And that's what our processor is designed around. And that's really where my partner's expertise originated in and really is in the sensor data algorithms, which drove the design of these processors.
So let me see if I'm thinking through this. If you have a network of IoT devices, let's say cameras, right? And traditionally, the function of the camera is to collect the visual intake and then use the backhaul to get that to somewhere centrally where it could be processed, rendered, whatever. And in this case, you could do all that at the edge and you're less reliant on backhaul or throughput, or maybe even not at all reliant on that to push as much data to some kind of central processing, right? Is that true? And then what use case does that enable?
So that is true. That's what we're envisioning. So in the camera case, let's just use that. It would enable homeowners to not have to rely on the cloud or send their data to some big company to process. So they control their own data. So that's kind of one use case, or companies, et cetera. The other interesting use case, and our funding comes from the government at the moment. So I've been thinking around, and it's just a huge market also, potential government use cases. And almost across the board, they're kind of dual use. In the government use case, there's lots of interest in edge processing, particularly in the near peer competitor fight. Like all those signals, even if they're not jammed, they're collected on. with our near peer adversaries. So the less signals you have to send out, the more likely you're able to use the tool, and the less likely they're able to collect on you or even identify your location, even if they can't get through your cryptography to get to understand what's on the signal. So that's another huge use case for this type of technology.
And for those listeners who don't understand near peer, I assume that's the likes of Russia, China.
Countries that have the resources to develop and use the technologies that we do, and that's getting lower and lower. I mean, Iran's building drones that even their surrogate adversaries are using to launch at us. So it's the near peer moniker is definitely getting lower down the country food chain.
No, I mean, everything's changing so quickly, and the war in Ukraine is showing that with the drone warfare. It's pretty unbelievable. Let me ask you a follow-up question on the privacy aspect, because obviously that's interesting. We talk about that on the show a lot, Alec specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And sort of, I want to ask it in light of the fact that you get government funding, because we have, this a lot of Bitcoin listeners, and they get very skeptical of the government sometimes, which is fine. But, it used to be in the crypto world, in the Bitcoin world back in the day, everything was going to be decentralized. You didn't need to have your trust in anyone or anything. But then, of course, with economies of scale, you find out that breaks down in many spaces or many avenues. But regardless, the reason I say that is with what you just mentioned about security cameras, that's obviously a huge win for just regular, everyday people. Are there any other use cases, and how exactly would that work with your technology, and why does your government funding not impede that?
Well, I mean, okay, I guess
it's a layered question.
A couple aspects to your question. Yeah, a couple aspects to your question. We can start with the government funding. It doesn't restrict our ability to apply the technology that we're developing, thanks to the government funding, outside of the government. So, and it certainly doesn't dictate who's manufacturing it, although there are some preferences. Then there's export controls around any kind of technology that we have to get approval, for example, to have TSMC manufacture our chips. So the fact that the government's funding it, I guess, shouldn't scare potential listeners out there. They're not dictating what we're doing in any way. They're helping us get along this technology development curve, which, in my experience so far in this company and talking to other founders that are developing kind of high capital intensive, deep tech technology, that's really where government funding is almost essential for it to happen. Venture firms aren't going to invest millions of dollars into an idea. They will for software, because if it scales for free, exponentially. Hardware requires an enormous amount of capital to just get the idea tested. And now that we have it tested, I'm starting to talk to potential commercial investors. But prior to that, it's really where I've found the government money is critical for this to even happen. So enough about the government funding. Other use cases are proof of concept. We've demonstrated, so I say proof of concept, it's actually a functioning chip that we've received back from TSMC, tested, and now we've demonstrated it in a partner company's device. This partner company builds sensors that can detect marijuana and tobacco smoke. So what's the use case for that? Well, hotels or schools, particularly, or car rental agencies that have policies against smoking in their rooms or cars. In the past, if the customer that happened to smoke in the room or car said, "Oh, I didn't smoke in there," it was really hard for those companies to get money from those customers or the insurance agency. Now they have a sensor that is accepted basically in court to prove that they were smoking in that room during the time they owned it. Point being, right now, that sensor data is being sent to the cloud to process, just like the camera data. Even though it's connected to shore power in a wall, it is still being sent to the cloud to process, which delays all sorts of things, like notifying the hotel manager, et cetera. So they're interested in trying to put a lot more of that onto their devices, even in a test case, and we were able to do that in our demonstration. So that's another example. I've talked to companies that are using sonar under the water to identify obstacles, and that's a potential other use case. Sensor data is, sonar data is not too different from video data. Let's see, voice transcription and those, or identifying keywords in audio. All those kind of use cases are things that our chip could help enable.
Yeah, interesting. And then just continuing on here, you mentioned TSMC. How's that relationship been with them? Working with them, and I guess we can go at it in many different angles, but let's keep it with security again. Obviously, security's got to be huge.
Yeah, so it was I was definitely kind of feeling around in a dark room trying to figure out that process. We wanted to do domestic manufacturing in the US. So I was initially contacting all the US manufacturers of computer chips. And for a variety of reasons, not all of them fell through. Skywater, at least at the time, I haven't looked at it recently, they didn't produce a technology new enough in the U.S. to enable our desired chip. We ended up falling on Global Foundries. Global Foundries produced a 40 nanometer semiconductor. They did do what they call multi-project wafer runs. So that's how, to answer one of, I think, Alex's questions, that's how small companies get into these, at least, and academics and other things get small batch runs in with these big manufacturers. They do multi-project wafers where they put a bunch of different people's projects or organizations' projects on the same wafer. So Global Foundries had that. So we were going down the Global Foundries route, partly because I had not received an export license for TSMC yet. I eventually got that, and concurrently, so backing up a step, we concurrently were talking to TSMC. Now, I say talking to TSMC, the way they deal with small companies like ours is they outsource the coordination with us. And there's really two entities that I understand in the US that they do this with. One's called Muse and the other's called Moses, MOSIS. We contacted them both. At the time, anyways, Muse was more user-friendly for us. And I think they may even been cheaper in their like, fees, their processing fees. I can't remember. So we ended up going with Muse, got the export license, and then it was kind of off to the races. They did all the coordination with TSMC. They pool the projects on, and they combine the projects onto a wafer and send that plan off to TSMC for production. TSMC, now, that is not like a massive production run where we have the whole wafer ourselves. We haven't done that yet. I think at the older technologies, it's very feasible with TSMC. The younger technology, or the newer technologies, the 3, 4, 2, whatever we're at now, they do not, at least Muse told us that it'd be very, very difficult for us to get on to one of those runs. At the time, it was 7 nanometer and better, mainly because TSMC and probably other foundries, foundry for your listeners, foundries are the chip manufacturing facilities. It's sensitive intellectual property, so they don't want to share it with every little company out there and every academic institution. So at the 12 nanometer, which is what we're shooting for, they're willing to share that with a company like ours to, integrate their requirements into our design. We ended up going, so why did we choose TSMC over Global Foundries? TSMC did 2 tape outs or manufacturing multi-project wafer runs a year. So every 6 months, with the 40 nanometer being the technology that we could afford. TSMC does a multi-project wafer run every month, and roughly for the same price as Global Foundries 40 nanometer, we could afford 28 nanometer. So it reduced risk monetarily, technologically, and timeline wise. If we missed for something happened at that 6 month MPW run with Global Foundries, we have to wait 6 months, which would bust our contract with the government on our production of a prototype. With TSMC, we had, we could just roll to the next month. So it was an easy decision business-wise for me. I wish we could find a U.S. manufacturer that was as met those requirements too.
So I have a lot of questions about
shoot
on this topic. So, and maybe this plays a little bit into the geopolitics behind the chip race, but so you tried to do this in the U.S. There wasn't a single foundry on the continent that could do that. Why is it so? And we, have funded R&D and investment through the CHIPS Act and other incentives. And I know that TSMC is building TSMC 2 right in Arizona. Why is it so hard? Like, why is there only one place in the world that this can be done?
So I wouldn't say it couldn't not have been done in the U.S. It would have been more expensive, more risky for us timeline wise, and not as good a technology. Now this process itself took about 2 years to get to last December when we received our chips back. So things could have changed in the last couple of years, but it's you're talking about building a big factory, so it doesn't happen overnight. Even though the U.S. has just dumped a bunch of money into it, these things aren't going to pop up tomorrow for a couple of reasons. One, you have to train the workers. As I think if you've read the news around the TSMC factory, they've imported Taiwanese workers, partly because they haven't been able to find or train up American workers quickly enough. Two, the technology, the lithograph technology to produce the chips is there's low supply of it. So there's one company in the world, and the name's escaping me right now, that produces this. There's some Nordic country, so it's just not. And I'm sure they're focusing their production lines on producing the latest ones because they get the most money for that. So that's another constraint. And TSMC, of course, can probably pay for those more than other companies at the moment. So those are a couple factors. Don't pretend to know all of them, but
yeah, no, I mean, I think it's complicated, right? Because you also have the raw materials that go into it, and so there's some of those are sourced here, from what I understand. And yeah, I have heard of this company in Europe that's part of this essential supply chain. But and we see a lot of news flow around China, Taiwan, U.S., right? And obviously the Chinese have been pretty aggressive in their sorties and naval penetration of the perimeter there on the strait. Is that largely driven by the chip race? Are there other factors that play around Taiwan? Like, what's your view on, and if China politically or kinetically controlled Taiwan, how far back does that set the rest of the Western world in chip capacity?
Huge. So Taiwan, TSMC, I think, produces like 80% of, or maybe even more, of the world's computer chips. And I believe that, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe the majority of that is actually on Taiwan. So a couple points to your question. One, I think that was a amazing, I don't know if it was intended, but now the world is reliant on Taiwan really to stay free and democratic from China, because that's the only way we can trust the chips, even remotely, that come out of Taiwan, is if China doesn't control Taiwan. So the world is defending, or a lot of the U.S., a lot of the world is opposed to China taking over Taiwan. For that reason, if there's no others, of course, the romantic in me likes to think that we want to defend what, at least on the surface, is a fairly democratic society, capitalist society, et cetera. So it's kind of a bulwark against the red tide of China around that area. But I think maybe not the only reason, but a huge reason is the fact that they're producing a critical technology for the world. I think that partly drives China's motivation to take it over, but I don't think that's really the reason. I think their motivation is just cultural and pride and everything else.
Do you think the reunification is more of the impetus than the TSMC foundry?
I think so. I mean, they've wanted to reunify well before TSMC became a dominant player in the semiconductor industry. Now, just like are wanting to defend a democracy over there, I'm sure China is even more incentivized to try to take over Taiwan, or at least have much more control over it because of the semiconductor powerhouse that it has become. Yeah, and I'm sure that our sanctions on China acquiring the latest lithograph technology is probably incentivizing them even more, because all of that is sitting right across the strait in Taiwan.
And my understanding of TSMC too is that they have stopped shy of exporting the most advanced capabilities. Is that true?
I honestly don't know. Perhaps I don't know the answer to that. Now, I mean,
yeah,
it's when you say export the latest. I mean, it's interesting because my very rudimentary understanding of this is the IP for a lot of that lithograph technology is actually developed by some company in California, but the people that build the machines and the company that owns that is in somewhere in the Baltics, or not Baltics, the Northern Europe, Scandinavia kind of area, and they produce them. So, I mean, our Intel and others can buy that technology. So it's not, Taiwan doesn't control the manufacturing technology. That company in Scandinavia does, but they have perfected the ability to integrate that into their production line, more so than appears like any other company, including Intel, which has been struggling lately.
Yeah. So maybe one more on this. So is there kind of a near term, and I don't mean like over the next 25 years, but maybe the next 5 to 10 years, outlook that says you could have a more internationally dispersed chip industry, or are we kind of locked into this very unilateral supply chain that relies on a couple different places?
Yeah, so I think there is a path, and that's certainly what the U.S. and other countries want, is a more spread out semiconductor manufacturing chain. I would not be surprised. This is just complete conjecture. If Taiwan would like it to be still centralized in Taiwan, because that gives them, as we talked about earlier, a motivation for people to protect their country, or countries to protect their country. But worldwide, there's enormous government investment in semiconductor manufacturing. So it's going to diversify just because of the amount of capital that's flowing into that, including, I mean, in the US, TSMC is building those. It's not, and they don't have a monopoly on the latest technology. Samsung, Intel, they're all working on the latest, next, whatever it is, 2 nanometer technology. It's just that TSMC seems to do it the best. They have less like errors and do it the quickest. So so far they're the winner out there. But I think it's definitely on path to spread out a little bit, even if it is just TSMC building factories elsewhere. So
Yeah, and maybe, sorry, one more
yeah.
question on. So given like that we've talked about, there's the raw materials, there's a lithograph, right? There's intellectual property. There's a lot that's going into the capacity of these foundries. If China were to have control over Taiwan, but then there was kind of a geopolitical backlash towards supplying TSMC with that supply chain,
Yeah.
does that render the foundry obsolete, or I'm just curious what happens there?
I don't know. I mean, I think it could go a lot of different ways. I mean, if China like invaded Taiwan, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of TSMC's manufacturing and intellectual property and capabilities were evacuated to some other location. If for no other reason than TSMC maintains a off Taiwan capability to generate capital to supply, the insurgency, whatever. It's complete conjecture. So I think it would, or China takes it over and TSMC is then producing for the market that is still supplied internally and externally by China. But I think there would be a backlash to providing them newer and newer technology as it evolves, just because they're using it for things that we, as the free world, kind of oppose. So I think that would happen.
Taking a moment to remind you that this show is brought to you by Tezor, home of the original Bitcoin hardware wallet. For over 10 years now, Tezor means business in Bitcoin security and functionality. When using their wallet software Tezor Suite to connect to the Bitcoin network, you're automatically connected via Tor, protecting your identity and giving you full control of your coins in a fully open source manner, both on the software level and on the hardware level. So head on over to Trezor.io to grab your Tezor Safe 3 with a secure element, Model T with a touchscreen, or the original Tezor 1, as well as a ton of available accessories to back up your keys and keep your coins safe. This show is proud to be associated with Tezor. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, where I'm located in Eastern Europe, it's front page news, always the war in Ukraine. And I think China is absolutely looking at how the Western world, or the free world, as you say, is responding to what Russia is doing. And Russia has, they are making, for their people, painfully slow, headways, but it's like at the rate of, a few meters a day if you look back over the last 2 years. And I think China's learning from that. They're very methodical, as we all know. Doesn't mean that they always make the right choice, as we also see with their ghost towns that they've had in the last 15 years. So it's a very complicated story, but I agree with Alec, and I mean it's a hugely fascinating little part of the world that, it's probably going to shape the next 30 years, frankly.
Yeah. And certainly, I mean, Alex mentioned raw materials multiple times. Certainly, raw materials are a huge part of the supply chain. And China controls a lot of the raw materials in the world now. So that's another geopolitical concern and lever that they have.
Well, let's bring it back maybe to the more specific to what you guys are doing. Just for me again, because I'm not so familiar with this topic, can you sort of concretely distill what it is that you guys are doing that's different than, like you said, another company in the U.S. that might be working with this Muse or Moses to import some chips?
So we're building. My partners developed a unique architecture specifically for processing parallel algorithms and data. And it's patented, etc. So different than the big companies that seem to be building off of their previous designs. We're starting from the ground up, and it appears that we have a unique position in the performance area where we have enormous memory bandwidth while consuming dramatically less electricity compared to others. Now they can point to other performance parameters where they're much better than us, but we're not shooting after those because we're purely focused on parallel processing. And our chip is it's an ASIC. You asked about ASICs earlier. It's an ASIC chip that is designed and produced for those applications. Is that a sufficient answer, or do you?
It's just interesting.
I can dive in. Actually, this might expand it a little more. So,
please.
70 plus years ago, a guy named von Neumann and a bunch of others, but his name is attached to it, designed the architecture that most of us know and love in our CPUs and even in the GPUs. The von Neumann architecture has a monolithic memory and then processors. So it's very good at serial processing. Does a step, goes back to that memory, does a step, and it can do that really fast in today's computers. And they try to mitigate that that going back and forth with caches, et cetera. But there's bottlenecks all over the place in the von Neumann architecture now, especially for algorithms that can be run in parallel, algorithms that can take advantage of sparse data. None of that can be taken advantage of in the von Neumann architecture, including in today's GPUs. We, starting from the ground up, don't have monolithic memory, don't have caches, paired the memory with the core, the processing cores themselves, and designed it specifically for parallel processing. And there's lots of companies out, I don't know about lots, in the 5 to 10 to 20 companies that are trying to do similar things, including probably the big semiconductor manufacturers. But as far as I can tell from the performance data that is out there, our chip handily beats those that are out there. And one other point, our chip is still flexible. Like, you can program those processors to add, subtract, multiply, divide. There are some processors, for example, the crypto or Bitcoin ASICs that are specifically designed for the cryptocurrency or the Bitcoin algorithm. They are not flexible. Like, those processors are only designed to add or subtract or divide, whatever it is in that algorithm. So ours can still be programmed so it is still flexible a little bit.
So I should have asked this earlier, but and I love this phrase, but what is massively parallel mean? And maybe just like, so what is parallel processing, and then what is massively?
So parallel processing, it means that each step is not reliant on a previous step. It can be done concurrently. So lots of video processing can be done that way. You're processing all the pixels across the entire screen at the same time. That's where GPUs kind of came about, but they're specifically focused on the math around the video, and they've been repurposed to lots of other kinds of parallel processing, but that was their original purpose. Massively parallel, that's a good question. My partners use that term all the time. I just picture algorithms that don't rely on anything in serial. But even some algorithms that have serial steps can be parallelized, and don't ask me how that's done. I'm not the math or the engineer expert in this company.
I wouldn't understand the answer, so you're safe. So, like, are there kind of like functions that are traditionally best served by serial versus functions that are best served by parallel?
Yes, I think most of the processes that you do on your laptop, it's serial processing, and word processing or using a spreadsheet, all those kind of things are certainly serial processes. Now, there's some applications that you can run on, like Monte Carlo simulations in the financial or other industries. Those things could potentially be run in parallel. They can be run in parallel. You're doing like thousands or millions of runs of the Monte Carlo simulation. Well, you can do them all in parallel and come to a conclusion a lot quicker than doing one simulation after another. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, actually, let me ask about something derivative of your answer. So one of the things that is inevitable, but I still think is kind of like not a good trend, is the finance industry sees compute power and the ability to like crunch massive like data sets, and they use it to find like, tiny advantages that can arb into large profits, right? And Rentech being like a famous beneficiary of that kind of like math beats research version of investing. And so that it also creates like these moats wherein the incumbents kind of can persist, and it's very hard to compete with them. Citadel's another version, right? So do you guys have ambitions in the finance sector, or do you even have an opinion on that type of use of this kind of power?
I don't know if I have an opinion. And we have thought about that potential use case. For my initial thought was that there's enormous amounts of capital in the financial sector. So they're not really worried about paying a few dollars extra more for power at the moment. But certainly mean, they're always concerned about money as well. So there's a potential use case there, and I'm open to any use case. As far as an opinion, I guess I don't know enough about it on the, I guess, moral, ethical side of this particular use case, or the finance industry creating moats with it. I don't know enough to form an opinion on that one.
That was the astute answer.
Chips, I'll be happy to sell it.
I was going to say, spoken like a wise CEO. I like that. No, I mean, like, I get it, right? And there's a pure capitalism to it that I'm not opposed to, but some part of me is also like, what economic value are they creating? Like, nothing's being built, right? It's just like, finding kind of like small advantages in time or data.
Yeah.
So maybe the use case that everyone talks about the most right now is like AI, right? And so the ability for me to have very inexpensive or even free access to AI image generation or large language models that can even be run on my laptop, or that are processed elsewhere, but are presented to me through a GUI or a web app or whatever. It just kind of exploded into everyone's reality when ChatGPT was released. Mm-hmm. Although that wasn't the first thing, right? But that was the one that was the zeitgeist. And so I think that's one of the potential applications for you, correct?
Yes, exactly. Our processor, we need a next generation of our processor to be able to run the large language models or other of the AI stuff that's been in the news on our processor on the edge, but it's very much within the target, the bullseye target of things that could operate on our chip once we scale it up a little bit.
And so in that edge use case, is it similar to the IoT one, where you need to do the processing wherever that human is or wherever that device is, to not rely on backhaul and maybe have a federated system as opposed to a centralized one?
Yeah, exactly. That would, I mean, even your phone or computer being able to leverage a large language model on it, as opposed to having to be connected to the cloud, including for voice, voice assistance. I mean, Siri doesn't work unless I'm connected to the internet. It'd be nice for at least some functionality to be on my phone, so I'm driving and can call my family or something. I don't know if I answer your question there.
Well, let me jump into that as well, because that's kind of goes back to what I was asking about the privacy and the the old dream of Bitcoin and decentralized tech was you would take everything away from a centralized sort of party. But I mean, someone's got to process this data, like you said about. I don't even know how to ask my question, but you're talking about how you want to take things out of the cloud. Can you drill down a little bit more on how your technology can do that?
Yeah. So again, I'm not the expert on these things. My understanding of these enormous models is that they're trained with enormous like server farms. So they're using billions or trillions of data points to train these models. But that's once they're trained, you can run the model a lot more. You don't have to have that enormous data set. You can run the model elsewhere. But right now, elsewhere is still in the cloud. And I've read some headlines about some models being able to be run on your laptop, but I guarantee you it's not as effective as the enormous cloud model. The idea would be that we can increase the ability of an edge processor to compute those types of models, partly because it's focused on being able to run things in parallel, which those models, those algorithms can be run in parallel. I think that answers your question. Like the things that are currently done in the cloud could be done on the edge because we're increasing the compute capabilities of what's on the edge while decreasing the power consumption required to do that compute.
And what service providers or people in the supply chain do you need, business partners to help you realize that goal?
Any device manufacturer out there that is trying to process or currently is processing sensor data or running algorithms on the sensor data, I guess that's what I mean by processing sensor data, is running algorithms or decision-making programs on the sensor data. Any of them that are currently doing that in the cloud, we can probably do it more efficiently at the edge, or there's other use cases, companies that I've talked to that build on-premise servers. So, companies, or in the tactical environment, the military environment, a unit that doesn't want to leverage the cloud but needs the large amount of compute capability. They have servers that kind of travel with that unit. Our chips could be integrated into those servers to process data that currently is being processed in the cloud.
So let's think a little bit about the darker side of this, because it sounds like it would enable autonomous activity, right? Because if you don't have to connect back to process, in the cloud or at a central location, then your IoT or your machine or your, robot dog or whatever can really kind of like function on its own as long as it has the power to persist in the field, right? And
Yep.
so the advantages there are obvious, but there's like how do you shut it off, right? And there's the Skynet version of
Yeah.
that, right? And so I'm an AI optimist, but it's hard not to look at some of the potential downsides. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think you need to. I mean, in your kind of prep topics, you asked about regulations. I think this is a role for government regulation, to ensure that there are proper constraints in place around the AI space. And in the military context, or development of weapon systems that leverage AI, you still need to have a human in the loop, ensuring that. I mean, for example, I mean, we use Hellfires or other. They're not autonomous, but they're released from a human control, like direct human control, and they hit a target, and we control it en route to the target. That control could potentially be handed off to AI in some capacity, but there still needs to be a human in the loop that can say, "Oh, that's not the target we want," or "There's a child that just ran into the screen," or whatever, and divert the missile or whatever the weapon system is, or the robot dog that whatever the use case is. I think there needs to be a human in the loop still that has that ability to inject the human moral, ethical reasoning. And there probably should, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this space at all, but I think there probably needs to be some sort of fail safes built into the programming as well. And again, potentially a role for government regulation. Even though I hate government regulation, there's potentially a role there for it.
There you go. The audience just did a little hooray. So would you allow a AI powered, like helper robot to live in your house?
Me? Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what its capabilities are. A Roomba that does more than a random sweep of my rug, and gets stuck in all sorts of places because it's not very smart. I'd be down with a little smarter Roomba. Um, a robot that could potentially destroy my house, I don't know. I don't know if I trust it quite yet. I'd have to get some experience with it first.
Yeah, and
Yeah, but like laundry, right? No one likes doing laundry.
Yeah,
So
I would be very happy to have a robot do my laundry. I have 3 kids. They produce lots of laundry. I didn't know little kids could produce that much laundry.
I'm with you.
What about the autonomous driving industry? Is that anything that you guys could
Yeah,
touch?
absolutely. I mean, that's a classic potential use case. The interesting part of cars is they're a large vehicle that can have a server rack in the back, even a small one. And it produces its own enough power, or can carry a large enough battery that the electrical power savings that our chips would enable aren't necessarily the critical thing that's holding back the self-driving car industry. It is potentially the thing that's holding back, aerial drones, or at least constraining their ability to fly for as long, et cetera. So we've been thinking more along the aerial drone route, but the technology would be the same across the robot autonomy spectrum.
Yeah. So, and I want to be sensitive to your time here to, keep it to an hour, but um, I have two kind of unrelated questions, so I'll just throw them out there. One is when you see some of these like visual displays that are powered by coordinated drones, right? That are kind of like the new fireworks.
Yeah.
Like, do you see that as like awe-inspiring or horrifying?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. I mean, something
Yeah.
horrifying can also be awe-inspiring. I mean, for entertainment wise, it's pretty neat. What is semi horrifying to me is that our adversaries in a military context could control a swarm of drones like that. And we need to have countermeasures to that. So, yeah, I think we
But the
have some.
countermeasures are
Go ahead.
it's the countermeasures become much more difficult if those are autonomous, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, it makes it
Yeah.
a little scary there. Yeah, I mean, drones
Yeah.
are obviously a facet of the military world now. So, and
For
they're
sure.
cheap. That's the interesting aspect of that thing is they're very cheap. Our countermeasures currently are not. So there's an economic incentive to make the countermeasures cheaper as well.
That's unbelievable. It's very interesting. I mean, that's Ukraine is going to be number one, I think, as far as giving learnings on this topic.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. Well, we saw like, F-35s and F-22s shooting down, inexpensive
Yeah,
Shahed drones from Tehran, right?
yeah,
Like it
absolutely.
was impressive, but the asymmetry of the defensive side there was on full display.
Yeah, exactly. The amount, like the millions or billions of dollars we sent to shoot those down, and they, thousands or millions they spent to fly them over towards Israel. Huge disparity there. Um,
Yeah, it's
yeah.
wild. So I have a kind of wrap up question. Just would love your opinion as to like, and this is meant to be a much more positive end note. Like, what do you see in the compute and chip industry, or in your pipeline of development that's inspiring? That's like hey, like these are the change the world use cases.
I think kind of democratizing AI, as we've kind of been talking about across the board, and I think you know maybe the last decade of my life, we've been hearing about the Internet of Things, which is certainly out there, but it's not very smart. it's and so I think making that smarter and more useful to the world is going to be a interesting evolution in the computation world or the semiconductor world. Um, the ability to make there's lots of non-war or non-conflict use cases for autonomous drones that make our world safer. I mean, hell, like cleaning up the ocean that could be done more autonomously is my guess. Just a guess. I don't know. I'm throwing a use case out there that could help the world as opposed to uh, enabling conflict. So I think there's lots of things that AI and increasing computational abilities will help us as well, and including, I mean, those are just like the physical manifestations. There's lots of things that can be discovered leveraging AI now, hopefully, that in the healthcare industry or other spaces that hopefully will be helping the world as opposed to hurting it. There's two
Yeah,
sides
agreed.
to
I
the
mean,
coin, but
no, I agree, and I think that one of the most near term ones, which is a little bit difficult to quantify, is like people being given back some time. There's tools that I use right now that are actually making my day easier, right? And I agree with you on IoT, right? It's been kind of incumbent for a while. And the privacy nerd in me is like, your coffee machine doesn't need to talk to the internet, right? Like you can just push the button yourself. But I think there's a lot of good use cases for IoT, and sensors is kind of the obvious one.
yeah,
And there's a lot of defensive use cases for sensors that are more in line with our conversation. But there's a lot of things that sensors do that are meteorological, right? Or like wearables that give us
exactly.
health information. Like sensors mean it doesn't just mean cameras.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree with all that. So I'm optimistic. I think it's a pretty neat space to be in. Um, obviously, it wasn't from a tech background coming into this, but it's exciting to be a part of it because it does touch on my old world of the defense and national security, but it's also touches on the commercial space, which is an interesting space as well. And of course, our success in the commercial space influences our ability to be secure as a nation. So that's exciting to be a part of it.
Love it. That's a perfect note to end on. Derek, thank you for coming. You're generous with your time. It's really good to see you. Before we wrap, where can our listeners find you, or Nanvan, or investors can ping you where?
Nanvan.com, and there's a link on the website, an info email link to get to me. We're also on LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter or Facebook or those other things yet. Anyways, I haven't found a need, but Facebook is another location they can reach out to me on.
Lucky you.
Would love to hear from anybody that has a use case or wants to give us money.
Better to stay off the social
without
media.
Any strings attached. No money with no strings.
Sure. Well, hopefully our listeners can help you out there. So you never know with some of the Bitcoin folks.
Yeah, that'd be neat. Thank you all for inviting me on. It's been a really fun conversation.
Thank you, Derek. Very interesting. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Cheers,